Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining me. I want to hit on a couple of topics very briefly and then move to what's obviously tops on my mind as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, the situation in Ukraine and the challenges it poses for the world. But I want to start on a couple of other items. First, the Senate today will pass significant postal reform. This has been a long time in coming, literally 10 plus years. This postal reform will do two critically important things. One, it will deal with the postal system's balance sheet that has been out of whack for years. Without getting into all the details, the Postal Service has to make health care and retirement payments much differently than any other federal agency. This will equalize the Postal Service with other federal agencies, literally providing about a $40 billion over the lifetime of the retirement system relief to the post office. It will also, this postal reform will mandate 6-day delivery across the country, and for a lot of rural communities, that's very important. It will also bring about additional transparency. This is bipartisan. And I know we've seen, particularly in the last year and a half with COVID, a lot of delays in postal service. I've seen it particularly in the Charlottesville area. It's taken me a couple visits there. We get a Band-Aid approach, and we've seen, for example, over the holidays, improvement. Then we've seen some of the service go back. This will be a kind of structural reform that I believe will give the Postal Service the resources they need, and some places are going to have to raise their salaries to make sure we've got steady, dependable, reliable mail service, number one. Number two, we're in the last few hours of getting together what's generally called the omnibus bill, which will finish out the funding for this federal fiscal year. And it's really important that we get it done. It includes the Intel authorization bill that I've worked on. It includes mandatory cyber reporting legislation, something I've been working on literally for the last year and a half. Only about 30% of our cyber attacks in this country are actually reported to the government. That's crazy, particularly as we see the potential cyber attacks coming from Russia in light of the Ukraine situation. Reporting the government's important, not so much just the government has that information, but that it's shared then with other private sector partners. The vast majority of cyber attacks are against the private sector. We've got to make sure that we're informed and our private sector partners are able to stand up. Passing a budget, which is Congress's ultimate responsibility, is also critically important for Virginia. If we were not to pass a budget and take place with what's called a continuing resolution, just limping along on last year's budget, I don't think there'd be any state in the country that would be more dramatically hurt than Virginia. We've got a lot of military expenditures in Virginia, ship repair, other items. If you're relying on last year's budget, a lot of that doesn't get funded. And for a state like Virginia, where we've fought long and hard to pass the once in 40-year infrastructure bill, if we don't have a full year budget, literally it will cost Virginia, just in the highway funding, a couple $100 million. That's crazy. We've got to get that job done, and I believe it'll get done this afternoon. In the omnibus legislation as well, there is $12 billion now in both humanitarian aid for Ukraine and additional military aid, and we will come back to that in a moment. We're on day 13 of the war in Ukraine. This is a war that has united the world, united our country. Vladimir Putin, Russian forces have been, I believe, are committing war crimes real time for the world to see. And I have been very pleased by, frankly, the administration's response in rebuilding our critically important alliance, not just NATO, but other nations around the world. I was glad today that the president joined efforts that I've been proposing and others about stopping the import of Russian oil. Now, Russian oil doesn't make a huge impact in America. It's about 3% of crude oil, about 8% of refined products. But by putting this ban on Russian oil products, what it also sends is a signal to our European friends who rely much more on Russian oil. I think the British have already announced that they're going to move in that direction as well. But the real power, I think, will come as private companies decide that they will stop doing business with Russian energy products because the fact that we are sanctioning this effort may lead to them getting exposed. So I think this will have a carry-on effect. And I remind everybody that our European friends have actually borne much more of the burden of the sanctions package on Russia. Europe trades about 10 times as much trade with Russia on a regular basis. We trade only about $28 billion. Russia does, or Europe does about 10 times that. So I think it's important that we step up. Now, I know this may and could result in higher gas prices. And I know, particularly in rural Virginia, you got to drive to work, you got to get your kids to school. This is causing real hurt. And I think some of the things we can do, I'm glad the president has released 30 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. I frankly think we ought to look at, and I'm working with some of my colleagues on a bipartisan basis on other ways we can increase domestic production, that it's already been leased, for example. About 90% of the oil production in America, for example, comes on private land, not on federal land. There's literally thousands of leases that have been let to energy companies that, candidly, a lot of that drilling and a lot of that effort was shut down early on in COVID. Now that the markets are back up and frankly higher than they were pre-COVID at $130 a barrel, I think many of those energy companies are looking at restarting those efforts, and we're exploring ways that we can help push that effort along. But I don't want to underestimate the fact that with record high gas prices, that we could see a bit more. On the situation in Ukraine, 13 days in, as I said at the outset, I think we're all impressed by the resilience of President Zelensky, the Ukrainian forces. Unfortunately, this is creating, as we see, not only these brutal images of refugees being bombed as they try to get out on humanitarian relief corridors, which is outrageous. I want to also note there's a number of foreign students studying in Ukraine. They need to get out as well. And unfortunately, there's about 80,000 students and others that are from Africa, that it appears that some of the borders are not being as willing to allow those Africans living in Ukraine to get out. I think that's wrong. I've written both the Ukrainian ambassador and the ambassadors of all the surrounding nations to say, you need to treat all folks alike who are trying to exit. And these pictures of these humanitarian bombings is just outrageous. I'm still pleasantly surprised that the Russian forces have not ratcheted up their whole cyber efforts. I think today the leaders of the intelligence community are appearing before the House committee, and there are certain things we've been surprised in how inefficient and ineffective some of the Russian military forces are. On the cyber front, I think it's still been a choice. Russian cyber skills are first rate, and we just don't have a full answer on why all those tools have not been brought to bear. My concern is they may be using and saving some of these tools as Russia tries to strike back against the West for the economic pain. They may try to unleash the literally thousands of cyber criminals that are in Russia to launch ransomware and other kind of cyber attacks against us. One of the reasons why in this budget bill, this mandatory cyber reporting legislation is so important. I know we've got a lot of questions. I just want to make one more comment. I'm not sure I hit everything, but I think over the last 3 or 4 years, we've gone through a really challenging time in this country. We've seen the disruption of January 6th. We've seen a presidential election where the previous president, after the fact, contested with a big lie the validity of that election. We've gone through COVID. We've seen the power of social media to transform and break us into more and more tribes, pitting one against each other. And I think there's been questions that all of us have felt is it still America's day? Can the values of liberal democracy, freedom of the press, ability to agree and disagree, have our votes counted in a fair way, freedom, democracy, can they really stand up, particularly as we've seen countries like China race ahead under authoritarian regimes? What is happening with Vladimir Putin is an authoritarian leader who is a bully, who will not and could not stop with conquest of Ukraine. And what we are seeing at the end of the day, what is happening in Ukraine is that the people of Ukraine are literally voting with their lives, saying they embrace the values of liberal democracy, which at times I think we in this country all need, we all sometimes take for granted. I think we need to acknowledge that with all of the messiness of our political system, this is still the best system that man has ever created. And I think you're seeing that as the American people rise up in support of the Ukrainian people, rise up and saying we will do what it takes to hold the line and support freedom and democratic principles that are being fought over in Ukraine. As the Ukrainians say, they're not just fighting for Ukraine, they're fighting for democracy. And I believe it is our day and our time to stand strong and resolute and make sure that Vladimir Putin, under no circumstances, can be successful in Ukraine, because this goes way, way beyond Ukraine. And I do hope as well that we will take that pause and say all of those, with all the challenges we face with liberal democracy, it still is the system that people are willing to fight and die for. With that, Laura, I'll turn it back to you and be happy to take questions.
Our first question will be from Madison McNamee from NBC 29.
Hi, yeah, so kind of going back to the Postal Service Reform Act. So I talked already with Abigail Spanberger about this, and she kind of briefed me, but we're kind of looking at, when this bill is passed, how quickly are we going to see change? Like you said, Charlottesville has faced some extreme mail delays, and we're kind of looking at when can we see that change come into play?
I don't want to, give immediate false hope. This will take some time for the Postal Service, even once the bill is signed, to get fully implemented. Frankly, it'll take time to continue to go out and hire the folks that are needed, not just in Charlottesville, but elsewhere. What I intend to do in the short term, and I know it's not just Charlottesville, it's around Albemarle County. I think Crozet has been particularly hard hit. I'm going to keep coming back to Charlottesville on a regular basis, bringing the local and regional leadership and keeping their feet to the fire. There have been ways, as we saw over the holidays, where the post office brought in other workers from other postal areas that weren't under such strain. And until we get the structural reforms in place, as the bill gets fully implemented, I want to keep the pressure on to make sure that the region and the local services are delivered in a regular fashion.
Our next question will be from Kelsey Childress with WSET.
Hi, Senator Warner. Thanks for doing this. Going back to the ban on Russian energy imports, I know you already touched on it a little, but how will this ban on Russian imports impact the gas prices for Americans?
Well, oil is traded on a global basis, and shutting out this relatively small amount of oil that we use from Russia could end up driving up world energy prices. And remember, though, that if we continue to import this Russian oil, we, Americans, are on one hand sending Ukrainians humanitarian relief and sending Ukraine military weapons to fight against the Russians. But if we continue to buy Russian oil, a lot of those funds go directly to finance the Russian military efforts and the Russian government. So, we need to step up on this. I think the American people are prepared to do it. I think other countries will act as well. And we've already seen private companies. I mentioned Shell in my opening comments, but I think you'll see other major international energy companies step up because they don't want to do business with frankly, a war crimes regime that Vladimir Putin and his oligarchs are perpetrating. But you could see, as overall energy prices go up, that sometimes gets translated to the gas pump. I worry at times, and we've seen this over the past, where sometimes some of the energy companies do a little bit of price gouging. I think we need to investigate that. I think that's something that needs to be documented if it's going on. But it's one of the reasons why I've also supported the president's efforts to release oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And I also am looking at ways that we can incent those domestic energy sources that, frankly, on their own, not because of government mandate, but on their own, chose to cap their wells back at the beginning of COVID because the market wasn't there, to get those already drilled wells reopened, those leases that have already been permitted gone ahead and drilled if need be to make sure that we've got that additional domestic energy supply.
Our next question will be from Hannah Brandt with Nexstar.
Hey there, Senator. Sorry to go a bit off topic with this. I wanted to ask you, the People's Convoy leaders are meeting with some of your colleagues today, and basically they're calling on lawmakers to end the state of emergency and to end all federal vaccine mandates. I wanted to see what you thought about that message.
I mean, so you're telling me that these folks who, as we saw in Canada, disrupted people's lives, disrupted the functioning of the Canadian capital, who are coming down now and trying to disrupt traffic in the greater Washington area, they want to end emergency mandates? I don't get the connection here. People got a right to protest, but the right to disrupt commerce and trade, or people being able to get to work or get to school or get to the store, I think is selfish. I think there are appropriate forums to protest. Again, the reason we are coming out of the scourge of COVID is because people got vaccinated, because people decided to respect one another and wear masks. Listen, I was glad to see that the mask mandates were taken down, but it has to be driven by science. And as our country approaches 1 million deaths from COVID, as I think the worldwide figures approach 6 million, to walk away from science and healthcare prescriptions is not the right thing. And frankly, when you've got these folks trying to disrupt commerce, business, and people's daily lives, they say they want freedom. Well, they ought to allow the people in this region the freedom to go to work, go to school, get their kids to school, go to the store without impediment.
Our next question is from Ian Munro with the Daily News Record.
Hey, afternoon, Senator. Farmers have told me that blood, sweat, and diesel are three of the main things that power farms, such as the Shenandoah Valley. Other than releases from the reserve, what immediate efforts can be done to help bring down the price of diesel, as farmers are already kind of trapped between other sources of inflation and concentration of processors in the industry?
Yeah, Ian, this is one of the reasons why I do think we need to look whether there's any price gouging going on from the energy companies. Yes, oil prices have gone up, but I saw some of the prices, particularly out in the western states, that seem to go way beyond even oil at $130 a barrel. I think continued use of an expansion and incentives for some of these domestic companies that frankly chose not to develop their energy sources at the beginning of COVID. I think they need to get back out on those leases that have already been leased, those wells that have been capped, and get those into production. I also think this is a horrible analogy, but there may be, Ukraine, for example, is one of the most important food sources in terms particularly of wheat and other products, agricultural products. And one of the challenges may be that this will also could result in, with Ukraine's source coming off the marketplace, increased agricultural prices, which could indirectly benefit in the short term some of the farmers. But obviously that would be, again, an extra inflation burden for customers. So I will look further into the issues on diesel specifically. I focus more on the gas issue and the gasoline issue. But I'll also try to get back to you specifically for some specific suggestions on diesel.
Great. Thanks, Senator. Appreciate it.
Our next question will be Jim
whether you're a
Spencer.
consumer, clearly energy prices are at unacceptable level, and we need to use our tools, including increased domestic production, to bring those costs down.
Our next question will be Jim Spencer from the Daily Progress.
Senator, thanks for taking my question. We're only 13 days into this war, and there's lots of stuff that's been done, but Americans are not generally patient people. And when you're talking about $5 a gallon gas, you're going to have to ask people to really dig in and tolerate things that they're really not used to. I use the term first world problems a lot, but what are you going to do, or how can you convince Virginians and Americans generally to take the long view of this, because it's going to be uncomfortable for them for some period of time, and it's really an unspecific period of time, but it's going to be a heck of a lot longer than 13 days.
Well, Jim, you're right, and and I do think all of us, including the president, frankly, need to do a better job of explaining why what's happening in Ukraine is so much bigger than just Ukraine. This really is a clash of the notions of everything we stand for in this country: freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, democracy, that your vote counts, against an authoritarian regime. May not be communist anymore, but it's every bit as brutal. Thousands of people already in Russia arrested for being willing to speak out, shutting down of religious freedom, shutting down of personal freedoms, a top-down system that is inherently corrupt with oligarchs. Jim, I'm old enough, and I think you are maybe as well, that I grew up during the Cold War. And literally for decades, Americans bore the burden of increased military spending, of being willing to stand up against the threat that communism and the Soviet Union placed. That was a 30-year endeavor. Now, I don't believe this is going to be a 30-year endeavor, but the idea that we're not going to be at least as stalwart as folks even in my generation were around the Cold War, or the analogies back to Winston Churchill rallying the British people against Hitler, or the Americans helping Europe, helping Britain survive during World War II. Americans were willing to sacrifice, and at least everything I've seen at this point, we have lived in a world for the last 30 years after the fall of communism where we didn't face that existential threat. I'm not saying that Russia, clearly how Russia with inept that's been on its immediate military, but Russia has, in just terms of total number, the most number of nuclear weapons in the world. So the idea that Americans aren't going to stand strong with fellow democracies, I think we will rise to the occasion.
Our next question will be Ben Dennis with WIRC.
Senator, I appreciate your availability and candor and your staff's ability to set this up as well. You had mentioned, I heard you mention that it was somewhat surprising, if you will, that Russia had not unleashed their full cyber capabilities. My question is, do you have any intelligence that there may be an imminent cyber attack or threat to the United States and NATO allies?
Well, I'm going to get a chance to ask that question in public on Thursday morning when the leaders of the intelligence community, CIA, Director of National Intelligence, NSA, the FBI, a couple of others, come before my Senate Intelligence Committee. And I will ask them that question in public. What I can tell you is the community has been surprised and doesn't have a full explanation of why Russia has not used some of their more destructive tools against Ukraine. One of the reasons, speculation is that, and this is what I was concerned at the beginning of the conflict, that if you launch these cyber weapons, malware, particularly that has worms in them, where they literally go into systems and destroy that system, once you unleash that weapon, it doesn't respect geographic boundaries. So far, mostly what Russia has launched against Ukraine has been called wiperware, where it tries to wipe out systems, but it doesn't really fully destroy the system. And it's been mostly caught within Ukrainian networks. And my speculation is they didn't do that because, as we saw with the NotPetya attack a number of years back, they launched that against Ukraine back in 2016, 2017, I believe, and it cost billions of dollars in the West. It actually cost billions of dollars in Russia because that malware went beyond geographic borders. But I don't have any immediate intelligence that we are on the verge of Russian cyber attack, but clearly CISA, the cybersecurity agency, has urged all our private sector to have what's called shields up. And the truth is, a good cyber offense, and Russia will have a good cyber offense, they probably could break into our systems. Why we have to then have a quick reporting and the ability to stay resilient. And I think we have to be honest enough to expect, as these economic sanctions tighten down and down, and you've got Putin, an autocrat that's got very few inputs coming in, and he is increasingly isolated, I think he will use his tools. So while maybe not imminent, the idea that over the coming days or weeks, I do expect that we'll see increased cyber activity, whether it be from their government or more likely, at least initially, from the cyber criminals launching ransomware attacks against the West. Will they start with America and Britain and Germany, or will they start with some of the weaker nations in NATO? Again, time will tell, but I don't think we can say by any means we're out of the woods.
And we have time
Senator,
for
if
two
I
more
could follow
questions.
up very quickly.
We actually can't follow up. We have to move on to our next question. Our next question is going to be from Mitchell Miller with WTOP.
Hi, Senator. Following up on that point, only related to conventional attacks, as the world tightens the screws on Russia, the Director of National Intelligence today testified that he worries that Putin may double down in Ukraine. Do you worry about the intensification of shelling of cities and innocent civilians trying to leave Ukraine in the coming weeks?
Mitchell, I've been horrified by the images that we've already seen. I've been even more horrified by the intelligence reports of Russia's brutal murder of Ukrainian citizens simply trying to escape. The estimates now that the original idea of 4 million refugees is probably too low. We're approaching 2 million already. So I'm horribly worried and that human cost, why we need to continue to ship assistance over to the Ukrainians directly, military in other words. I've seen reports, public reports, not off intel, that up to 17,000 anti-tank javelins and other tools have been sent to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have been ferocious, and as we've seen, even in some of these smaller towns where the Russian forces take over, that does not mean it's the end of Ukrainian resistance. The Ukrainian people, I don't believe, can be defeated by the forces that Russia has put to date. Will the Ukrainian military be defeated? Potentially. Will they be able to take over certain cities? Probably in some long term, or in some short term. But the ability of the Ukrainian people to resist, I think, is an inspiration to all of us. But I am very worried about Putin, and why I think you've seen so many organizations, medical organizations, journalists, others, starting to bring cases already that these Russian forces are committing war crimes. And I hope and pray that some of these Russian commanders on the ground, recognizing there could be long-term consequences beyond what happens in the immediate battlefield, could pay a price. I think you're already starting to see, saw one of the governors in Siberia being attacked at a public hearing by Russian citizens, saying why were they sending their young men as what they called cannon fodder to be killed by the Ukrainians as they simply follow Vladimir Putin's orders here. So I think there's many more chapters to be written on this story.
Our last question will be from Amy Knowles with the VA Dogwood.
Hey, Senator Warner, thanks for taking our questions. If I can switch the topic, today is International Women's Day, and I was wondering if you could talk about a woman that has inspired you.
Well, I'm inspired every day by my wife of 33 years and my 3 daughters, all who are launched into their careers or finishing up school. I guess I got to default as well to, on a personal basis, to my mom, who grew up in a time where she wasn't able to, she made a choice to stay as a homemaker, but really was an inspiration to me and my sister as we grew up, and I moved around some, so had to help me as I had to adjust in different states and different schools. And I think as we see, the International Women's Conference, I think, is actually being held, I believe, in Dubai today. The history of this day, I think, goes back. Tim Kaine was telling me earlier, and so if I'm wrong on this, Amy, get Tim Kaine in trouble, not me. But supposedly this goes back to some kind of women's ceremony that took place literally hundreds of years ago, and it was around springtime, and then it evolved into actually a march in Russia and during the Bolshevik Revolution. And I'm quickly getting way beyond my skis on how the day was created. But get Tim Kaine; he's got a great story on this. But I appreciate you answering that. And since I lived, or for the last 20 plus years, all my daughters have moved out, but I lived in a household of only women. I respect their strength, their leadership, and I know to follow their advice. I think we're down. I've got 15 seconds left, right? So let me just thank everybody. Again, I urge us all, just not as reporters, and me not as a senator, but just as Americans, to take a deep breath and realize, what Ukraine is doing is they're fighting for the way of life. They aspire to have the kind of freedoms we take for granted, and with all the problems, we still live in the best system in the world. Thank you all.